David Mitchell had just returned from a week-long business trip to Tokyo when he witnessed a scene that shattered his heart. His 7-year-old son Tyler was crying outside the neighbor's door, with his hands stretched toward a plate of food, begging for something to eat. The boy was so thin that his clothes hung loose on his frame. He had deep circles under his eyes and trembled as he pleaded for mercy. David, one of the richest men in America, owner of a $300 million financial empire, couldn't believe his eyes. How was it possible that his son was literally starving to death in their $5 million mansion in the Hamptons? Who was the woman supposed to be caring for Tyler during his absence? And where the hell was Margaret, the nanny he paid $5,000 a month precisely to avoid situations like this? What David discovered in the following minutes would forever change his relationship with money, success, and fatherly love. David Mitchell had always believed that loving a child meant giving him everything money could buy. At 42 years old, he had managed to build a financial empire starting from nothing. Mitchell Holdings controlled real estate, tech, and energy investments across half of America. He owned mansions in the Hamptons, Manhattan, Malibu, and Miami, a collection of luxury cars, and a private jet he used to constantly travel between business meetings. His 7-year-old son Tyler lived in the family estate in the Hamptons, a 10,000-square-foot mansion surrounded by 20 acres of manicured grounds. In theory, the boy had everything: expensive toys, designer clothes, a bedroom larger than most people's apartments, a private nanny paid a fortune, and a trust fund that many adults could only dream of. In practice, Tyler had everything except the most important thing: a present father. David spent at least 20 days a month away from home. When he was in New York, he left at 6 in the morning and returned after 10 at night, often when Tyler was already asleep. Weekends were dedicated to business dinners, social events, impromptu trips to close urgent deals. He had completely delegated his son's care to Margaret Stevens, a 50-year-old nanny with excellent references and a salary that made her one of the highest-paid domestic workers in America. Tyler's mother, Sarah, had died in a car accident when the boy was 3 years old. Since then, David had buried himself even deeper in work to cope with the loss, convincing himself that the only way to honor his wife's memory was to ensure Tyler a financially secure future. Every million earned was another brick in the security building he was constructing for his son. But David had never really talked to Tyler. He didn't know what his favorite games were, if he was doing well in school, if he had friends, if he was happy or sad. The only information he received came through Margaret, who during their brief phone calls always assured him that everything was fine and that Tyler was a quiet and well-behaved child. That September week, David had flown to Tokyo to finalize the acquisition of a tech company worth $50 million. It had been the biggest deal of his career, one that would definitively project him into the elite of international finance. He had celebrated with Dom Perignon champagne in the penthouse of the Park Hyatt, imagining how to invest the profits to guarantee Tyler an even more golden future. The return flight had landed at JFK at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. David had taken his Lamborghini from the VIP parking and driven toward home whistling, excited to tell Margaret about the deal's success. Maybe for once, he would even take Tyler out to dinner to celebrate. But when he entered the mansion's driveway, what he saw paralyzed him. Through the hedge that separated his property from the neighbors, he glimpsed a small, thin figure crouched outside the Henderson family's door. It was a child wearing a yellow t-shirt that was too big and crying desperately. David stopped the car and looked closer. His blood ran cold when he recognized that child. It was Tyler, his son, begging the neighbors to give him food. The boy was unrecognizable. He had lost at least 10 pounds. His cheeks were hollow, his sunken eyes surrounded by purple circles. The clothes that had once fit him perfectly now hung on him like rags. He trembled as he held out his little hands toward the plate that Mrs. Henderson was offering him with obvious compassion. David got out of the car, feeling his legs shake. He couldn't connect the image of that malnourished child with the son he had left 7 days earlier. What the hell had happened in a week? When Tyler saw him, instead of running toward him like any child happy to see his dad would do, he cowered against the neighbor's door as if he were afraid. His eyes, once bright and curious, were now dull and full of a sadness that should never exist in a 7-year-old's eyes. David felt his world collapse. In that moment, he understood that all his millions, all his successes, all his properties meant nothing if his son was literally starving to death a few yards from the most luxurious mansion in the neighborhood. What he was about to discover would forever destroy his certainties about fatherhood, money, and the meaning of success. David slowly approached Tyler, trying to control the panic rising in his throat. The child looked at him with eyes that showed no joy or relief, but something much more disturbing: resignation, as if he had learned not to expect anything good from his father. Mrs. Henderson, a 60-year-old woman who had known the family for years, stood up from the step where she was kneeling next to Tyler. In her eyes, David saw a mix of anger and pity that made him feel like the worst human being in the world. When David asked what had happened, Mrs. Henderson couldn't hold back. With a voice trembling with indignation, she began to tell what she had witnessed in recent days. Tyler had been knocking on their door every morning at 7, saying he was hungry and there was nothing to eat at home. At first, she had thought the child was exaggerating, as children often do when they want snacks or treats. But then she had noticed Tyler getting thinner and thinner. His clothes began to look too big. His face became gaunt. His energy decreased. When she had tried calling the Mitchell house to speak with the nanny, no one ever answered. David's cell phone was always busy or turned off. The truth was even more shocking. Margaret Stevens had abandoned her job 3 days after David's departure for Tokyo without saying a word to anyone. She had simply packed her bags and left, leaving Tyler completely alone in that enormous mansion. A 7-year-old child, with no adult to take care of him, forced to survive on what he could find in the refrigerator, until even that was empty. David felt his legs give way. He collapsed on the steps next to his son, realizing the monstrosity of what had happened. Tyler had spent 4 days alone, without food, without anyone to comfort him when he was scared at night, without anyone noticing he was literally disappearing. The child had tried to manage as best he could. He had finished all the cookies in the pantry, eaten dry cereal because he didn't know how to use the stove, drunk tap water to fill his empty stomach. When even that was gone, he had started knocking on neighbors' doors, too young to understand that what he was experiencing wasn't normal. The Hendersons had fed him every time he came to them, but they were simple people who didn't know how to handle such a situation. They had thought about calling social services, but didn't want to create problems for a rich and influential family. They had hoped David would return soon, and everything would resolve itself. Now David looked at his son and saw the consequences of his negligence written on every inch of the small, fragile body. Tyler no longer cried, asked no questions, demanded no explanations. He was simply there, sitting next to a father who had managed to build a financial empire but had failed at the most important thing: protecting the only person he had in the world. When David tried to pick him up, Tyler didn't resist, but didn't abandon himself to his embrace either. It was as if the child had learned not to expect anything good from adults, not even from his own father. David carried him into the house, into that mansion full of expensive objects and empty of human warmth. He opened the refrigerator and realized Margaret had left only some expired yogurt and a bottle of spoiled milk. The pantries were empty, the kitchen cold and unused. While preparing a meal for Tyler with what he could find, David began to understand the enormity of his failure as a father. He had thought love meant leaving $1 million inheritance, guaranteeing financial security, buying everything a child could desire. But he had forgotten the simplest and most fundamental thing: being present, being the safe harbor a child can return to when the world becomes too big and scary, being the person who notices when something's wrong, who realizes if his son is happy or sad, who knows his favorite foods and nighttime fears. That night, David didn't sleep. He sat beside Tyler's bed, watching that small body breathe regularly after finally eating something nutritious. And he realized he had to choose: continue being the richest man in an emotional graveyard, or learn to be the father Tyler had always deserved but never had. The days that followed were the most difficult of David's life. For the first time in 20 years of his career, he canceled all appointments and turned off his business phone. The financial world could wait. His son couldn't wait any longer. Tyler took almost a week to return to eating normally. David had to feed him small portions every 2 hours, like with newborns. Every bite the child managed to keep down was a small victory. But the real damage was emotional. Tyler had become a silent child who asked no questions, expressed no desires. He had learned that adults disappear, that you can't count on anyone. The turning point came one night when David heard Tyler crying. He found him huddled in bed, shaken by nightmares. When he asked what he had dreamed, Tyler whispered that he had dreamed of being alone again. David took him in his arms and for the first time cried in front of his son. He apologized for abandoning him, promised he would never be alone again. Tyler completely abandoned himself to his father's embrace, and David understood that this was the first time his son truly trusted him.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
In the following days, David began to truly know Tyler. He discovered he loved adventure books, had a passion for animals, drew with natural talent. He was also terribly lonely. He had no real friends. David made radical decisions. He reduced work commitments to essentials, sold properties that required too much travel. He transformed one of the offices into a playroom. He enrolled Tyler in a regular school instead of the private boarding school. Every evening, he helped Tyler with homework. He wasn't as good as Margaret, but his presence was what mattered. Weekends became sacred. Just him and Tyler exploring New York, going to the park, eating ice cream like a normal family. Slowly, he saw the silent child transform back into the lively son he had always been. Tyler began asking questions, talking about school, laughing at David's jokes. The real test came when David had to travel to London. Instead of leaving Tyler with a nanny, he brought him along. During the flight, Tyler told him he was no longer afraid because he knew his dad would always come back. 6 months after that terrible discovery, the Mitchell mansion had become a completely different place. The once silent rooms now echoed with Tyler's laughter and the sound of his games. David had learned that a house full of life is much more beautiful than a house full of expensive objects. The most evident change was in Tyler himself. The thin, frightened child had become healthy and lively. He had regained weight, his cheeks were rosy again, his eyes sparkled once more. But most importantly, he had regained trust in adults. David had kept all his promises. He had drastically reduced business travel, delegating responsibilities to collaborators. When he had to leave, Tyler came with him, or the trip was postponed. There were no longer deals so urgent as to justify abandoning his son. Their daily routine had become sacred. David walked Tyler to school every morning, often stopping to talk with other parents. In the afternoon, he helped with homework, not to check grades, but because that had become their time together. Weekends were dedicated completely to Tyler. They had explored every museum in New York, every park, every corner of the city. David had learned to see his city through a child's eyes. The most important moment came when Tyler asked for a dog. They spent weeks at shelters, choosing Lucky together, a mixed breed who needed a second chance, just like their relationship. David had also changed his approach to business. The company had introduced family-friendly policies, and he had created a fund to support families in difficulty. The true consecration came when Tyler invited him to speak to his class. David told the children that being rich means having people who love you, not having lots of money. When Tyler looked at him with pride, David understood he had finally found true wealth. 1 year after that terrible episode, David and Tyler had built a relationship that seemed like a miracle to anyone who knew them. The cold, absent father had become the most present and affectionate man imaginable, and the traumatized, closed child had returned to being a joyful and trusting boy. David had made a revolutionary discovery. Being a present father didn't mean giving up professional success, but completely redefining it. Mitchell Holdings continued to prosper, but now it was guided by different principles. David had learned that decisions made with serenity and emotional balance were often better than those made in the frenzy of blind ambition. His colleagues had noticed the change. David had become a more empathetic leader, more attentive to his team's human needs. Meetings no longer extended late into the night without reason. Objectives were ambitious but realistic, and the work environment had become more serene and productive. Tyler, for his part, had blossomed in ways David never could have imagined. The child had developed an inner confidence that made him popular at school. He had formed sincere friendships with classmates who often came to play at their house. David loved those chaotic afternoons, full of children running through the mansion, transforming those once sterile rooms into a real home. The relationship with Lucky, the dog they had adopted, had become special. Tyler had learned responsibility by taking care of his four-legged friend, but most importantly, had experienced the unconditional love that only an animal can give. David often watched Tyler play with Lucky in the garden, and in those moments he realized how blind he had been in the past. One day, during one of their evening walks in Central Park, Tyler had asked a question that deeply touched David. He had asked if he felt sad about losing all that money by spending less time at work. The question had made David smile, realizing how much his scale of values had changed. He explained that he actually hadn't lost anything important. He had gained time, serenity, health, and most importantly, had gained his son's respect and love. The money he hadn't earned was nothing compared to what he had obtained. The chance to see Tyler grow day by day, to be part of his successes and difficulties, to be the stable reference point in his life. David had also discovered simple pleasures that his previous life had never allowed him to experience. Cooking together with Tyler on Sunday mornings, watching animated movies cuddled on the couch, building sandcastles during beach vacations. These moments were worth more than all the million-dollar contracts he had signed in previous years. But the real test of their new relationship came when Tyler got sick with the flu. For David, who had previously delegated every aspect of his son's care, personally taking care of sick Tyler was a revelation. He spent 3 days at home, taking his temperature, preparing broths, reading him stories to help him sleep. During those sick days, David saw how much their bond had grown. Tyler wasn't afraid when he was ill because he knew Dad was there and would take care of him. There was no longer that emotional distance that had separated them for years. The most emotional moment came when Tyler, during his recovery, told him he was the best dad in the world. Not because he was rich or important, but because he always stayed with him when he needed it. Those words moved David more than any professional recognition he had ever received. 2 years after that terrible afternoon that changed everything, David Mitchell had become a completely different man. The finance magnate obsessed with power and money had transformed into a present father, a serene man, and a person who finally knew the value of important things. Tyler was 9 years old and had grown into a confident, affectionate boy who was extraordinarily mature for his age. The experience of abandonment, instead of breaking him, had made him stronger and more aware of the value of human relationships. He had become a child who knew how to appreciate every moment spent with the people he loved, because he had learned firsthand how fragile the security we take for granted can be. The Hamptons mansion had become a place full of life and warmth. No longer the perfect museum David had built to impress guests and business partners, but a real home where a father and son built memories every day. The rooms echoed with Tyler's laughter and his friends, the sound of Lucky running through the corridors, the music David had learned to love by listening to his son's tastes. David had maintained his successful position in the business world, but had completely redefined what success meant. Mitchell Holdings prospered under his more balanced and humane guidance. He had created a corporate culture that valued employee well-being as much as profits, and this had brought better results than he had ever achieved with the ruthless methods of the past. But most importantly, David had discovered that being a present and involved father gave him energy and creativity that also improved his professional performance. Solutions to business problems came more easily when his mind was serene and his heart was full of Tyler's love. The child had become his source of inspiration, even at work. Seeing the world through his son's pure and just eyes, David had begun choosing investments and partnerships that had a positive impact on society. He had refused highly profitable but ethically questionable deals, preferring to build an empire that Tyler could be proud to inherit one day. During one of their weekly dinners, which had become a sacred ritual, Tyler had asked a question that deeply struck David. He had asked if he regretted the money he hadn't earned by spending more time with him instead of at work. David had smiled, realizing how the question revealed his son's hidden wisdom. He explained that he had discovered something incredible. When you're happy and serene, you work better and more intelligently. Paradoxically, after reducing work hours to be with Tyler, his earnings had increased because his decisions were more thoughtful and creative. But most importantly, he told him, he had understood that there are things money can't buy, and that, once lost, can't be recovered. Time with people you love, a child's trust, the joy of seeing him grow happy and secure. These are true riches, and he had risked losing them forever, chasing false and temporary wealth. Tyler had listened with that seriousness that sometimes amazed David, then made an observation that touched his heart. He said he was happy he had become a poor dad, because poor dads have time for their children. David had laughed, explaining to Tyler that they were actually still very rich in money, but now they were especially rich in love, time, and serenity. And this was the most precious combination that existed. On a spring evening, while they sat in the garden watching Lucky play among the flowers, Tyler had shared a dream he was cultivating with David. He wanted to become a veterinarian to help animals like Lucky, who needed a second chance. David listened with pride, realizing his son was growing up with solid values and a generous heart. That night, after putting Tyler to bed, David stayed a long time in his room watching him sleep. He thought back to that terrible afternoon 2 years before, when he had found his son begging for food from neighbors. Now he saw a serene child who slept secure in his dad's love, and he realized he had lived his personal miracle. He had lost a frightened child hungry for affection and found a happy boy full of confidence. He had lost the version of himself obsessed with external success and found the man he had always wanted to be, but never had the courage to become. David got up from the chair next to Tyler's bed and looked out the window at the garden illuminated by moonlight. In that moment, surrounded by the serene silence of his house full of love, he realized he was the richest man in the world, not for the millions in his bank account, but for the infinite wealth sleeping in the bed next to him, his son's unconditional love, and the certainty of having finally understood what it truly means to live. Like, if you believe presence is worth more than any expensive gift, comment which moment of the story touched you most. Share to inspire those who have forgotten what it means to be a parent. Subscribe for more stories of families finding each other again. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand you've already won life's lottery. Sometimes true success is in a child's laughter when they trust you. And sometimes, the richest dads are those who have time for a bedtime story. Because the only inheritance that truly matters are the memories of love you leave in the hearts of those you love.